In 1989, Don Piper was killed instantly when his Ford Escort was crushed in a head-on collision. After paramedics declared him dead, Don came back to life. In his book, People I Met at the Gates of Heaven, Don reveals the loved ones who greeted him at the pearly gates and the role we play in populating heaven.
Don Piper joins us now. I imagine people never get tired of hearing you talk about what you experienced in those 90 minutes. I mean, lots of people, Don, have near-death experiences, right, and sometimes their stories, you know, are similar, sometimes not. But you were actually clinically declared dead for 90 minutes before you were resuscitated. What happened?
Four paramedics came. There were 4 vehicles involved in this horrific accident. And so they dispatched 4 ambulances, and they were working on the victims. Nobody else was hurt but me. So that meant that 4 paramedics were working on me, which is very unusual. But they did everything they could, and they were not successful. So I was pronounced dead on the scene by the 4 paramedics. And since the windows were all knocked out of the car and it was roof peeled back, I was exposed. And it was really quite awful looking. So they covered me up with a tarp, the body, and they waited for the coroner to come. Preacher came up on the accident and saw this and asked if he could pray for the victims. Well, I was the only victim, and he was told there's no one to pray for. This man is dead. He said, well, God has told me to pray for him. They said, well, go right ahead if you feel like it. And he says, I want to get in the car. Well, you can't do that. If you get in the car, you could be hurt. There's all this twisted metal, broken glass. But he did. He got in that car, and he got behind me, which is the only way he could get in the car, and he put his hand on my right shoulder under the tarp that I was covered up with, and he prayed for an hour and a half.
Good grief.
At the end of that hour and a half, people were praying everywhere for me, but they didn't know I was a fatality. They'd just been called. He's praying, holding onto my shoulder, and he sings, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and I start singing it with him.
Wow.
Well, he was shocked and got out of the car and said to the policeman, Officer, the dead man is singing. And nobody believed him. He finally threatened that if they didn't come and check on me, he was going to lie down in front of the ambulance, not let them leave without me. So they came to check on me and found out I was alive, not very, and they had to get me out of that car. And that began the rest of my life here on earth, was the recovery and finding a new normal, because I was never going to be the same again.
You know, one of the things God impressed upon this pastor who prayed for you was to pray that you wouldn't have any internal injuries or brain damage. And though you didn't have either of those things, your body was so badly mangled.
Yeah, it was. I lost 4.5 inches of my left femur, was ejected from the car and never found. My left arm was severed right in the middle of the forearm, and the arm was dislocated at the shoulder, went over my head into the back seat, and from here forward was lying on the back seat of the car. My right leg was crushed because the dashboard collapsed on it, so I had catastrophic injuries that many people would never recover from. I ended up getting double pneumonia in a very short period of time. And they had to decide whether to remove everything that was left so they could elevate me, get breathing treatments, or try a new experimental treatment that had never been done in the country called external fixators. And they're the large bone-stretching devices you've probably seen in people's necks or on their ankle. They're halos, and the wires go through you and come out the other side. So I wore one of those on my femur, the first one ever, for over a year, and I wore one on my left arm for about 8 months. And they turn screws on these 4 times a day to try to stretch the bones to replace the one that is missing. So I wore that for a year. It was a long...
30-plus surgeries, so many things to overcome in coming back. Let's go for a moment first to the glory of what you saw when you left here. We'll come back to the pain and the rehab, but you came to heaven immediately.
Immediately. I didn't go down a tunnel. There wasn't a bright light. I don't discount that. I think that happens to some people who are passing away. I was killed instantly. I just took my last breath on the bridge and immediately took my next breath at the gates of heaven. There are 12 gates in heaven, of course, and I was at one of them that looks like the inside of an oyster.
And you were met by all of these people who had had impact on your life spiritually.
It did.
On this
absolutely.
side. Were you surprised by that?
I guess I was surprised to be greeted by people immediately. And I was surprised by a couple of the faces of the people that were there. People often ask me, did you see anybody there that you didn't expect to see? And the answer is yes. Not because they had lived, bad lives here. It's just because I was not really that aware of the impact that they had on my life spiritually.
Yeah.
But lying in a hospital bed for a year and a half, you have a lot of time to think about that. Yeah. And so I remembered those faces. Very few I've ever discussed before this book, and what impact they had on my life. And I knew that they had helped me get there.
Yeah.
I knew that they were the people who took me to church when I didn't have a way to go. They're the ones who talked to me about Jesus. They're the ones who gave me my first Bible. They were the ones who lived a spiritual life in front of me so I know what one was. And they greeted me at the gates of heaven. It was like they helped me get there, and they were there to receive me when I arrived.
I love what you said in the book. They were expecting you.
They were expecting me. You don't sneak up on heaven.
Yeah.
Everybody there knows who's coming. And they certainly knew I was coming that day because they were outside the gates to greet me and welcome me. When I saw their faces, I knew where I was.
Yeah, and they were all well. I think that's such a comfort to so many people who might have lost loved ones in unbearable, unpleasant circumstances. Absolutely. To know that when you saw these people, they were whole in every way.
Unblemished, unscarred. I often say my great-grandmother had no teeth. But when I saw her in heaven, she smiled at me. And it was the first time I ever saw her real smile in my life. And she looked beautiful.
And was it your grandfather who was missing fingers?
He was missing fingers on both hands.
Wow.
He was a carpenter by trade, and over his lifetime, he'd had some injuries. So he was missing 3 fingers on one hand and 2 on the other. When he reached his hands out to me, and I looked at them, because he held me when I was a little boy, and I was fascinated by those stubs. I looked down, and all of his fingers were there.
Wow.
And I'd never seen them before. And he said, "Welcome home, Donnie." And I was home. That is my home. This is not my home.
Being greeted by people who had been so instrumental in both large and small ways in your spiritual walk had to be the catalyst for this book. Your first one was about your death experience, but this is people I met at the gates of heaven.
Right.
Tell me about the why behind this book.
Well, I was greeted by 3 teenagers when I was 15 years old, the summer before my, junior year. They came to my house for visiting for the church. And I got my driver's license, so even though nobody else in my family went to church at that time, I told them, "Yes, I'll come to your church. Will you be there?" And they said, "Yes, we'll greet you at the door." They did. One of those people greeted me at the gates of heaven because she died of diabetes. Yeah. Another one of the kids that was in that Bible study class who was killed at 18 right after we graduated from high school, Mike Wood, was standing at the gates of heaven when I arrived because he had an influence on my life as well. So they greeted me at the gates because they helped me get there. So I talk about a lot of people like that, which I've never talked about these people before. And I really that didn't struggle. I just had to decide whether I was going to disclose something that was very personal and intimate. But I wanted people to know that people really influenced me for Jesus. They really had these impacts on me. And I think that's exactly what we're here for, is to help everyone else get there.
So that's the invitation, folks, both to heaven and to be an influence. The book is called People I Met at the Gates of Heaven. Who's going to be there because of you? Well, it's available wherever books are sold. It's a fascinating recount of all that's gone on in Don's life. And we thank you so much for sharing it. May we all be motivated.
Thank you. I'll see you at the gates.
Okay, it's a deal. I'll meet you there.